Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the sixth of the 2014 Darwin College Lectures, which are on the broad theme of plagues. And it's a welcome not just to everyone here in the Lady Mitchell Hall, but to everyone who watches later on the video link around the world, as these lectures are freely available and many thousands of people can view them later. This is a very important year for Darwin College as we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the founding of the college as the first college in Cambridge exclusively for graduate students and the first mixed college. From a small beginning, we are now amongst the largest college, and we have an alumni body that encompasses every subject and is spread around the world. I'm very pleased to welcome this evening's lecturer, Professor Stephen Emmott. Stephen studied for his undergraduate degree in experimental psychology at York and then for a PhD in computational neuroscience at Stirling. His career took him to the AT&T Bell Laboratories and the NRC Corporation. But for the last 10 years, he's been here in Cambridge at Microsoft Research, where he's head of computational science. Here now in the 21st century, most of the major issues faced by our societies are linked in some way to demands on planet Earth. Our need for food, shelter, land, energy, water, and not too much nor too little. That humanity is also changing the natural world. We see that in climate, extinction of species, deforestation, pollution of air, soil and water. And we are the driving force. Both our individual and our national desires for a better life than our predecessors is combined with huge population increases. Now, Stephen Emmett's book, 10 Billion, was published just 5 months ago. It's attracted much attention, and tonight we have the honour of hearing from him directly. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Stephen Emmott to speak on the human plague.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Master. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's quite something to be invited to give a Darwin lecture, and I confess I'm not entirely sure why I've been invited. More importantly, that may be a question you all ask at the end of this talk rather than at the beginning of it also, so just to set expectations properly. Whilst I'm talking about setting expectations, I should just mention that I only have one core competency, and that's dumbing things down. So you be prepared for that in this talk. But hopefully the consequence of that is it manages to be able to convey some complicated things in a fairly simple way. Many of the things that I'm talking about here are fairly complex issues. As the Master mentioned, published a book a few months ago, which has received a lot of attention, not all of it good, but at least it's generated some kind of debate about some of the issues. I also want to thank the organisers for the title, which I rashly accepted, because there isn't really such a thing as a human plague. But I noticed in the Oxford English Dictionary that one of the definitions of a plague is a calamity. And I think that we can rightly call the situation that we face right now an unprecedented emergency, an unprecedented calamity in the making. And so in some sense, the title fits very well. So I'll make a start. So I think the main message of the talk is that we are the drivers for almost every global problem that we face. And every one of those problems is set to grow as we continue to grow. And that one of the principal reasons for that is the way in which we consume things. And I'll explain a little bit about some of the things that I think are unsustainable to consume if we're to avoid such a catastrophe. in the next few decades. So just a quick reminder about us. Just over 200 years ago, there were fewer than a billion of us. When I was born in 1960, there were 3 billion people on the planet. And in my lifetime alone, I know I still look like quite a young chap, but I am over 50. In my lifetime alone, the global population has more than doubled. There are now over 7 billion people. By 2050, there are going to be, roughly speaking, about 9.5 billion people. And the UN projects that by 2100, there will be at least 10 billion of us. And that's even if, optimistically, birth rates, fertility rates continue to decline as they have done, roughly speaking, over the last 30 years or so, and there's evidence that that's actually not happening so rapidly. It's also worth pointing out that the UN also projects that under something called the constant fertility variant, which is the fertility rate in 2014, if that were to continue, I think that's unlikely, but it is worth pointing out that if that were to continue, the population at the end of this century would not be 10 billion people. It would be 28 billion people. There is every possibility that the population could be far greater than 10 billion, by the way. And the UN population statistics have been revised upwards, or I think for the last 3-4 estimate revisions over the last decade or so. It was under 10 billion in 2000, and it's now 11 billion in the latest figures. So things are not looking optimistic in terms of population. One of the things that all of these people have done in a very short period is fundamentally alter much of the planet. And one of the problems that we face is a consequence of land use. And in the following forms. First is urbanization. We all need somewhere to live. Something like 50% of the human population currently now live in cities. And by 2050, that's projected to be 70% of us will live in cities. It's interesting that what was once, not that long ago, 1950s, 1960s, some of the world's great cities like London, New York, Chicago, Paris, in terms of their size, not necessarily their standing in the world, but in terms of their size, only a few decades ago, are now being eclipsed by rapidly growing cities elsewhere in the world. So in London in 1960, when I was born, as I mentioned, there were approximately about 6.6 million people who lived in London. Around 18 million people lived in New York. But now there's cities that are growing most rapidly include, for example, Dhaka in Bangladesh, which has 14 million people, a population of 14 million people. Sao Paulo in Brazil, which has an official population of 20 million, and that doesn't include people who live in favelas. It could be as much as 30 million people. Shanghai, which is a population, I'm talking about a municipal population around the city, including this, of roughly speaking 23 million people. Karachi in Pakistan, which has a population of 23 million people. These are cities that have grown very, very rapidly. And Jakarta in Indonesia, which has a population of 37 million people in its municipal surroundings. And it's interesting that we can actually see this really impressive and, in some sense, beautiful picture of our influence, particularly in cities, from space. And I just find this picture both beautiful and actually quite alarming in terms of our visibility from space and an illustration of our impact and our energy use all the way from space. In terms of land use, the other thing that we're doing is changing basically the face of the planet through extraction, whether it's extraction principally for metals, minerals, energy, fossil fuels, oil, gas, and also I could basically extend that to extraction of timber for either for pasture or cropland, or for timber directly, for burning in many parts of Asia and Africa, just to cook. This is I think it's a gold mine in Russia. This is the reason why I wanted to show this. This is artisanal gold mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the reason why I think it was worth putting up is, and there's another one by the way, in gold mining in Ghana, is that a recent study, I think it was like 2010, showed that there could be as many as between 20 million and 50 million people involved in artisanal gold mining around the world. And for those who know anything about gold mining in general, but particularly artisanal gold mining, involves an awful lot of arsenic and cyanide and mercury in the way in which they mine gold, which is polluting many rivers in areas where artisanal gold mining is growing. Could have showed pictures in Brazil as well. Copper mining, as the demand for the things that we consume, television, mobile phones, wiring for all of these buildings in cities that are growing rapidly, continues to grow. And the other principal source of land use is for food. David Tillman and Jonathan Foley, who's two of the leading experts in land use for agriculture, both estimate that we're using something like 40% of the entire ice-free land surface of the planet for agriculture right now, which is an interesting thing to consider, given that demand for food is expected to double by 2050. Now, people who are, well, let's call them rational optimists, will readily make the claim that that's not a problem because the Green Revolution, which we've in some sense benefited from greatly, not without some cost, which since the 1950s has increased yield significantly every decade with very little increase in land use. And there's a good reason, and I'll mention some of them later on, to indicate that that will not continue. So how we're going to double our food production without increasing land use, whether we have to double it is questionable, is going to be a challenge for us. It is worth pointing out, by the way, I don't know whether the pointer will work, the size of these irrigated plots. And I'll come, by the way, when I talk about irrigation, I'll come to water in a second. The scale of them, because this is a town. So I'll see whether this works. There's a little demo here of this is from we've put together this in my lab, but the data set for this is this SAGE, what's called the SAGE Hyde data set, partly from Jonathan Foley's lab. And what this is a plot of the growth in. This is just cropland and pasture, which isn't all of agricultural land, but this is just the growth of cropland and pasture since 1770 up to, I think it goes up to 2000. So it's quite extensive. And the rest, so that's just showing you where deserts are, where you can't really grow anything, and where ice is, and there's some arid land, and the green bits are tropical forests that remain. So it's quite, I think, an incredible illustration of the amount of land that we've used, appropriated for agriculture. So land use is one of the principal reasons for the problems that we're heading into, but which we've prospered from for a number of centuries. The second problem is, I want to call it a new species, but certainly in the last maybe 200 years, this emergence of consumerism in a way that has grown exponentially in some sense, in some areas. You might even want to call us, we're not Homo sapiens anymore, but Homo consumerini, or whatever that is. But I think I can give a good flavour of what I mean by this, certainly in the last 50 years. So the first is, the consume a lot of cars. Something like 2.6 billion motor vehicles have been manufactured since their invention. There are currently just over 1 billion motor vehicles still on the road. And I noticed, by the way, that when it was the Labour government at the time who had said that they were the greenest and most committed green government ever in existence, when the financial crash hit in 2008, 2007, the first thing they did was trying to convince everybody to buy a new car, which is at odds with being the greenest government ever. So this is a Volkswagen lot in Texas, but then we throw them away. It's true, much of this is now recycled, but nonetheless, it's an astonishing waste of materials and energy. We do like to buy our televisions. I'm struck by the fact that when I go home on the train from King's Cross to Denmark Hill, where I live in London, it sounds quite voyeuristic, but you can see in lots of people's houses, and everyone just has this, in the tiniest flats, just has these massive flat panel televisions on their wall, and often two in the same room. Not quite sure why. But we do like consuming new televisions when the next technology comes around, whether it's LED or LCD or whatever the next one's going to be, 3D. And we do like phones and related technologies. So this is the queue outside the Apple store in Covent Garden. This is hours before it opened, by the way. When the iPhone 5 arrived, iPhone 4 was obviously useless, one assumes, given the amount of people who were waiting for this. This is the Apple Store in Shanghai, waiting for it to open. News of this technology even reached Scotland, and this is the Apple Store in Glasgow. And this is the Apple Store, of course, in New York. And no one would deny that iPhones are actually a wonderful piece of technology, but do we need 5 versions of them to make a telephone call? So anyway, this is a queue for the Apple Store, nowhere near the Apple Store, but just outside in New York on Fifth Avenue. And this is more queuing for the Apple Store, except that everyone's already got an Apple and an iPhone. One is obviously not enough. And this is a man buys iPhone, which I find quite interesting. Finally, this chap's got an iPhone. It's obviously cause for celebration. Anyway, it's a sort of a little silly illustration of just how addicted we are to consuming things that we don't need. But if you needed more evidence, we clearly consume clothes at quite some rate. And by the way, it turns out that I will come on to water in a little while, but it turns out that iPhones, Windows phones, any phone, as well as clothes, do consume a lot of water to manufacture. So we do like buying our clothes. This is the orderly opening of Primark in London. Because, as you can see, no one is actually dressed very well, so they obviously need some new clothes. This is people looking surprisingly glum, given the fact that they seem to. I thought the whole point was the people shopped because it was enjoyable. Also in Primark, and we do love eating. By the way, I'll come to that in a second. But a very charming and very well respected and very clever demographer who wrote a book with a similar title as mine at about the same time, Population 10 Billion, Danny Dorling, who was at Sheffield, is now at Oxford, very nice chap. Danny's view is that the population will hit 10 billion, but we don't need to worry because everyone is going to start realizing that consuming in this way is really not a good idea, and we'll somehow all consume a lot less. Well, one thing is for certain, that no one has ever told anybody outside Primark that. or an Apple iPhone store. So anyway, eating. Eating seems to have become a international pastime rather than something we need to do or should do at mealtimes. Depending upon what assumptions one makes and depending upon what one makes of the data from on sales from McDonald's and the likes, we probably consume something in the order of at least 50 billion and almost certainly around 100 billion burgers per year worldwide. And again, depending upon what assumptions one wants to make and where one wants to get one's data from, each burger probably requires about 3,000 litres of water to produce. It looks very unappetizing, does this in a way, but I don't know why we would eat so many. And in addition to consuming all of this stuff, we do like to consume air travel, or principally air travel. We do like our holidays since the 1960s. And I'll come back to that in a second. So on to water. All of these things require, apart from a holiday, well, they require water to go to, I suppose, if you want to be by the sea. But all of these things require water, most notably water for the food that we eat, in its raw form and its processed form. About 70% of all usable water on Earth is used for irrigation of agriculture or pasture land for feeding animals. And most of that water comes from, here's another example. Most of that water comes from groundwater. And groundwater, here's another way of irrigating one's land directly from groundwater in a slightly more modest fashion. But groundwater in many parts of the world where A, population is growing fastest, and B, where agricultural demand is therefore growing fastest, is being depleted far faster than it can be replenished. The fact of the matter is we don't fully understand how aquifers work, and so make of that as you wish in terms of whether the groundwater depletion is going to continue for the following few decades, depending upon climate, of course, and depending upon extraction rates. But what we do know is it's not being replenished as fast as it can be. So there is a groundwater problem, and therefore there's an irrigation problem, and therefore there's a food problem on its way. And let's not forget absolutely profligate amounts of water that we use for things that we don't actually really need, like golf courses. Sorry if there's any golfers in there. If I've upset loads of golfers, and then someone's going to tell me that Darwin College has its own golf course somewhere. Anyway, transport. All of the things that we consume, as well as ourselves, are increasingly transported all across the planet. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is just a static diagram, and I encourage you to see a video of it, because it's absolutely amazing to watch of just when the time zones change from west to east, about air traffic. This is 24 hours of air traffic, and we are flying. Oh, thank you very much. We are flying billions of passenger kilometres per year, and the growth is quite astonishing, even from the 1970s and 80s. All of this stuff that we are consuming tends to be shipped around the world on very large and very polluting sea container ships. And roughly speaking, again, depending on what assumptions one wants to make, approximately 500 million of these shipping containers will be shipped around the world and handled in different ports, which is absolutely just this year, which is quite astonishing, especially given the fact that 80% of the stuff is stuff that we just don't need. In addition to all of this stuff being transported, it obviously requires a lot of energy to both produce use, and then dispose of. And I'll mention, obviously, the obvious ones. Most of that continues to come from oil and coal. Gas usage is increasing sharply, but it's still a fossil fuel, just one that's slightly less dangerous. Even the US government, Energy Information Authority, and the UK government, and BP, all estimate that energy demand is likely to triple by the end of this century, and that the principal source of that energy will continue to be fossil fuels. And quite astonishingly, the most predominant fossil fuel will continue to be coal, which of course is the worst one that we could use. This is tar sands, oil from tar sands in Canada. This is oil from what you would think of an oil rig. This is actually, interestingly, because I think the term peak oil is a bogus one. We're continually finding new oil, coal, and gas reserves all around the planet, and this is one that was recently discovered off the coast of Bahia in Brazil. It's enormous. Gas from all over the place. Increasingly, there's this so-called energy game-changing revolution, which is shale oil and gas from hydraulic fracturing, which has taken, obviously, hold in the US. I'm about to arrive here. But as I mentioned, coal is the principal source of our energy supply. And this is a mine in the US. But it's not massive mines. These are women gathering coal that's mined basically by hand in, I think it's Bangladesh. But it's not just oil, coal, and gas that are producing lots of greenhouse gases. The use of wood, as I mentioned earlier, simply for just getting by every day for cooking, is increasingly causing a problem in terms of it's a release of black carbon, so not fully combusted fossil fuels, in this case wood. So you think of it as soot, effectively, but also soot from coal-fired power stations and diesel cars. It's particularly in Africa and even more so in Asia, is really causing a major problem in terms of black carbon, in terms of both its greenhouse gas effect, but also its health effects. And I think it's over 1 billion people, depending upon whose data one wishes to use, now rely on wood as a principal source of their energy supply in Asia and Africa, which is quite astonishing. All of this causes pollution, principally, as you might expect, from nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide that's released from power stations, but also in terms of waste, in terms of the things that we consume. You know, I could have picked 1,000 pictures like this from all over the world. Waste production of this sort, by the way, is expected to grow by 300% over the next 6 or 7 decades. There was an interesting paper in Nature. It was a commentary piece, but it was an interesting paper in Nature a few months ago about this. And it's a big problem. The waste is a really big problem for us. It's not just this kind of waste from plastic, although that's the biggest one, but so-called e-waste from computers, phones that are no longer needed because the one that you had 6 months ago was clearly useless, and from televisions, PCs, is a big problem and a rapidly growing problem in developing countries. And I can see one of those coloured Macs there, which I would probably have died for 10 years ago. It's on a rubbish pile somewhere. Waste in coastal regions is a rapidly growing problem, both for marine life but also for the way of life in most of those coastal areas in developing countries, because most of the economic activity was from fishing. And it's increasingly no longer so, and that includes rivers and tributaries around coastal areas. and this isn't a particularly good photo, but this is a river. And this is some poor chap having to pick out things that he thinks he can make a living from pollution from waste, principally, again, plastic waste. And again, this is quite a common phenomenon in large parts of the developing world. And yet it's principally not their waste, it's principally ours. Other forms of pollution, I mentioned black carbon. This is the middle of the day in Jakarta, in Indonesia. This is the middle of the day in Beijing. Not every day, of course, either in Jakarta or Beijing, but it's pollution from black carbon is a major problem. This is, I think, around midday in Beijing on a similar day, and it's having a major effect on the health of hundreds of millions of people, particularly in Asia. As well as having a distinct problem that we're storing up in terms of climate. Now, the thing is that black carbon doesn't stay in the atmosphere for any longer than a few days, unlike CO2, which stays in the atmosphere for decades and decades. But we're producing this, nonetheless, every day, so it's always in the atmosphere, having a radiative forcing effect. And so that brings me on to the impact that this way of living and this growth in population is starting to have. And I should say that all of the things that I've shown you are basically the product of not much more than 2 billion people, even though there's 7 billion on the planet, other than the black carbon. And there's going to be another 3 billion of us on the planet, and all 10 billion are going to want to live pretty much how we want to live, how we have chosen to live. And I leave it to you to decide whether you think that is going to be possible or certainly sustainable. So the first major impact that this kind of consumption, and this way of living, and this population is going to have, and we're only just starting to see the first signs of it, is on our climate. And the principal reason for that, you can ignore the text at the bottom. My apologies, makes the slide look a bit busy, is that just like population growth, since basically the start of the Industrial Revolution, we've seen a massive increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. Most of this data comes from ice core data, which is very interesting and quite reliable data for measuring atmospheric, or what was once atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And this is storing up a major problem for ourselves. It reached for the first time, I think it was in May in 2013, 400 parts per million. IPCC reckon that to maintain a target of a no more than 2 degree rise in global average temperature, we would need to limit atmospheric CO2 concentrations to around 425, 450. Now, many in the scientific community, 425 to 450 parts per million. Now, many in the scientific community are increasingly of the view that we would need to limit CO2 concentrations to somewhat less than that. And we haven't got a chance of limiting CO2 concentrations to 425 in any case, and we're certainly not going to get any less than it is now for quite some period. That's if we did something radical, which we're not. The consequence, just the initial consequences of that level of CO2 in our atmosphere is a steady rise in global average temperatures, as I mentioned, roughly speaking, since the start of the Industrial Revolution or the middle of the Industrial Revolution. The global average temperature has risen by around 1 degree Celsius. This solid black line is a 5-year average, and if you can see it, the grey line is the annual average. And what's interesting about this is that there's climate deniers. I don't think there's anything wrong with being climate skeptic. I mean, science is organised skepticism, right? So there's nothing wrong with that, but just denying this doesn't make much sense. But what's interesting is that climate deniers and the Nigel Lawson's, that world-leading expert in environmental science, have latched onto is that there's been apparently no change in the temperature, planet's temperature, the global average temperature for a decade. So therefore, all of the people like me who say we have a problem are just scaremongering. Well, what's not the case is that the temperature has been steady, which it hasn't over the last decade. And nonetheless, the science community needs to explain this. But does it need to explain it any more than it would have needed to have explained this, or this, or this, or this bit? I mean, it's a highly complex and highly reactive system that determines this. And, we're modifying just about every component of it. So it can hardly expect it to just be some rulered straight line. Anyway, this is just the beginning of what we can expect. And as I'll mention shortly, the global average temperature rise doesn't really mean very much. What is going to be the really interesting phenomenon that comes with it, and I believe that we can rightly say that we've got sufficient evidence that the increases in extreme weather events associated with anthropogenic climate change are now just starting to happen. We've seen evidence of this in Somerset this year in England, but elsewhere, Ukraine, the US, Australia. One of the reasons, by the way, which even if you were to accept that this has been a decade of very little global average temperature, global warming, one of the reasons that's been projected for this is that a lot of the warming, for some reason we don't fully understand, has gone in to the oceans over the last decade or so. And this in itself is starting to cause a problem in terms of at least initially now, albeit small amounts of thermal expansion, but also slight ocean acidification. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that's starting to happen with quite some increasing frequency is extreme weather events associated with even this 1 degree, roughly speaking, change in global average temperature. So this is a flood in Pakistan. I think the people who live in Somerset should think themselves lucky they have not suffered this. But more closer to home, we are seeing not similar floods, but unprecedented flooding for at least a few decades. And then someone described this as Swanageddon or something, which seems a bit of, even for me, an overclaim. But it's an interesting picture. But it's not just floods, of course. It's extreme weather events in terms of heat and droughts, which is in terms of heat is actually causing a rapidly rising frequency of fires, not just forest fires, but fires in urban areas. I could have shown you this is actually a picture of Portugal. I could have shown you a picture of Greece or California or Australia to demonstrate the same kind of point. And what comes with extreme heat is increasing frequency of extreme drought. It's led to significant loss of crops in Australia, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine, the US, over the last few years, and that's predicted by the FAO, the US Department of Agriculture, and many in the science community to get much worse. Is loss of crops as a consequence of severe drought and severe heat waves. So climate is the first problem that everyone is familiar with that we're about to run into, and we're only just beginning to see the initial signs of climate change. And I personally believe that there's enough evidence to demonstrate to make the claim that we're in for increasingly significant trouble in terms of climate. But it's not just climate; it's food as a consequence of climate, and as a consequence of depletion of groundwater. So in terms of food, as I mentioned earlier, food demand is set to double by 2050, and the rational optimists are very keen to point out that actually that's not a problem. Because the claim is we waste 50% of food in developing countries at the production end and in developed countries at the retail end. So we can solve a lot of that problem by just being much more efficient. And the second claim that they make is that we can continue to grow yield without apparently any end by just continuing to increase inputs, energy and chemicals to buy every extra unit of food. There's significant and certainly sufficient evidence to not have much faith in that claim. And in addition to that, it doesn't take into account the fact that in many areas of the world where agriculture is most intense, there's a rapidly growing problem of soil erosion and threats of desertification. So this is a bit lurid, but this is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But I could have shown you a similar picture from David Tillman's group or my lab about vulnerability of desertification in different parts of the planet. Now, what's interesting about this is that you might, if you could recall the little video that I showed you about where land is being used for agriculture from 1770 to now, is that in most of the areas where vulnerability to desertification, and other forms of soil erosion, by the way, from runoff, from wind erosion because forests have been eroded, and a variety of other sources of soil degradation, is that most of the areas of extremely high vulnerability to desertification, some of them are in rich countries, also in the areas where agriculture is most intensive, and many of them are in areas where population is growing most rapidly. Anything yellow and above here is a problem. I won't bore you with all of the other sort of soil degradation graphs, but they're all pretty, more or less, pretty similar. So this is going to be a big problem, which the proponents of the unending benefits from the Green Revolution are unable to answer. The risks to water, by the way, map looks very similar. And that's not surprising, because most of these areas are where water use is going through the roof because of either population growth or through changes in consumption habits. As many of these people, by the way, in here and increasingly here, get lifted, what's about to happen here and some places down here, and especially here, get lifted out of poverty. People just consume more food, more stuff. All of it requires more water. So food is an emerging problem, and I've only mentioned just less than a handful of reasons for that. But desertification, water, climate change, and in particular the extreme weather events associated with climate change, whether it's extreme wet days or whether it's extreme hot days leading to drought, that either shuts down or irreparably damages the photosynthetic machinery, or during the grain filling part of the growing season, or damages the nitrogen fixation components of plants. And then there's a third one, which is ecosystem degradation. If we never produced another molecule of carbon dioxide, we're still in big trouble because of the rate at which we're degrading ecosystems. And it is just worth pointing out that ecosystems, by ecosystems I don't mean biodiversity, because it's a vague term, but ecosystem structure and function regulates large and significant components of the Earth system that we depend upon for our entire survival, and not least of which is the global carbon cycle. And one of the key components of the global carbon cycle is the world's biota and principally the world's plants, forests, and we're modifying the composition of the world's forests principally through deforestation at quite some rate. But what ecosystems do in terms of their structure and function, in ways that we're only just beginning to understand, is that they provide what's called, I don't particularly like the term because it's very anthropocentric, but they provide ecosystem services for us, and those, chief amongst those, are food, water, and as I just mentioned, our climate. And we're modifying ecosystem structure and function in most of the world's ecosystems. So whether that's overfishing, which we're all familiar with as a problem, but I will just point out that this comes from some work from Boris Worm and Derek Tittenser, who's a postdoc in my lab, is that it looks as though the percentage of the world's marine ecosystems that are either fully exploited, overexploited, or have even collapsed has gone from around 4% in 1900. This is dotted because obtaining data for this is very difficult. But this is when 1950 was when data started to be collected, up to something as much as 80% of the entire world's marine ecosystems have fallen into that category now, which should be alarming for everyone. Loss of habitat is the principal source of ecosystem degradation. Loss of habitat for urbanization, somewhere where we live, or for mining, or to raise animals or grow crops. And loss of habitat, as I said, is the principal reason for loss of species. Again, I'll just mention about loss of habitat, let's call it, for many terrestrial species, as from 1750 value is about 35% of all terrestrial habitat availability for many species. Before I come on to that, it is just worth saying that it's arguable, certainly a quite well-known paper by Barnowski and colleagues of a couple of years ago make a pretty decent case, but it's certainly arguable. But I'm prepared to believe the Barnowski modelling that we've almost certainly embarked on the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth. And in geological time, it's certainly faster and greater than the event that wiped out much of life on Earth 65 million years ago. But there is one thing I just wanted to end on. You'd be thankful that I have sort of just about ending. Is that our increasing population... Angela McLean made this point far more eloquently than I could ever do a few weeks ago in her Darwin lecture. Is that increasing urbanization, increasing density of population, and an increasing rate at which we're interacting with either wildlife, and that we're interacting with, for many people in some parts of the world, is interacting very closely with pigs and poultry, sometimes even in the same house, is really storing up the potential for a real plague and a pandemic of some novel pathogen crossing the species barrier. And most epidemiologists, I think, are now of the view that this is a case of when and not if. And could be tomorrow, it could be in 83 years' time. But if it were to happen, given our population and given the rate at which transmission can occur through air travel, there is a real possibility that this could be a major problem for us in terms of loss of human life. It may well be, I don't know what the number could be. Angela McLean would be a better person to ask, but it could be over 1 billion people who would die from such a plague. I mean, it is worth pointing out that the last one, which was 1918 and 19, the Spanish flu pandemic, killed what was originally thought to be somewhere between 20 and 40 million, was revised upwards to 50 million, is now thought to have killed about 100 million people. And that is before, one of our more questionable innovations, EasyJet, was invented. But the real problem here is that we actually don't know. We have no way of being able to predict or prevent or manage such a plague if one were to actually happen, and it's a real threat. So, just to conclude, what are we all doing about it? Well, the answer is very little. What are all these people doing about it? Well, not very much. Some of them probably recycle their Observer, and if they don't read the Observer, they probably don't recycle very much. And they probably recycle their glass and their tins. And they might even have bought a Prius before they all got recalled. But that is certainly not sufficient, given the scale and the magnitude of the problem that we face. What about the agencies that have been set up to tackle these kinds of problems as they start to emerge? Well, it isn't as though these problems were coming was not known. We've known about these problems in the scientific community for quite some time. Roughly speaking, I suppose about a quarter of a century. But I'll name just three of some of the most important ones in terms of their remit. So the first is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, whose job it's been for nearly a quarter of a century to tackle the problem of climate change. Completely failed. I aren't saying they're not well-meaning, just saying they've failed. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification, whose job it's been for almost a quarter of a century to halt the rate at which desertification is occurring, completely failed. And the Convention on Biological Diversity, whose job it's been for almost a quarter of a century to halt the rate of loss of biodiversity, completely failed. I'd give you one tiny example, which is that the number of white rhinos that were killed by poachers in South Africa as little as 10 years ago was about 20 per year. And this is CITES data, the Convention on Trade on Endangered Species. This is actually real white rhinos that have been found killed with their horns cut off. So this is not model projections. And it's certainly not overcounting. So 10 years ago, the number of white rhinos that were killed by poachers in South Africa was roughly 20 to 30. And last year it was 1,000. And it isn't as though we don't know about white rhinos are endangered. And if we can't even prevent something like that, when this is an iconic animal, we know that it's a problem, we know that they're close to extinction, and we know that they're poached. What hope have we got for less iconic species? But what these organisations do like to do is congratulate themselves, and here's a picture of Heidi Klum congratulating everybody for being champions of the earth, which I'm sure they've got to do. If there are any lawyers in the room, you might want to advise me about whether to keep this in or take it out in the video. And finally, what about actually political leaders directly? Well, whilst the faces might change, thankfully, some of them, the action remains the same, which is inaction, which is words and inaction. And we've had, when the science community have been telling politicians about the problems that are emerging and are now just starting to emerge, what we've had from political leaders is not leadership. What we've had is 30 years of words and inaction. And if you look, by the way, I showed this from 2009 because the recent COPs in Warsaw, they didn't even bother showing up. And, for example, and what we've had for 30 years is just words and inaction, and certainly not leadership for 30 years. And what we look set to have, when you look at the rhetoric that's coming out of what's called world leadership, is another 30 years of words and inaction. And all the while, we're heading deeper and deeper into trouble. So to finish, I mean, it's not a plague analogy, but I've used the analogy elsewhere. I think it is true that if we discovered this evening on the news that an asteroid had been discovered on its way to Earth, and we knew because of its size and its trajectory that it was going to hit Earth in 37 years, and it was going to wipe out even 40% of life on Earth, but let's just say 70%. And governments worldwide would marshal the entire planet into unprecedented action. Every business, every scientist, every engineer, and every university would be marshalled into preventing this or figuring out a way for the maximum number of people on Earth to survive if option one, preventing it, couldn't be avoided. And I think we're almost in precisely that situation now, except that there isn't an asteroid and there isn't a date. The problem is us, and we urgently need to do something about it, because I think we can rightly say that the situation we face right now is an unprecedented planetary emergency. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking lecture. First of all, though, I can assure you that Darwin College does not have a golf course. We have a small amount of lawn by the river. I mean, we all know that the inventiveness and cleverness of people has been key to combating or alleviating poverty and inequality and disease and biological plagues, and that improvements and discovery and education lead to better quality of life and increasing lifespans. But, Stephen, you've just demonstrated so very clearly the major problems that the world now faces, and it's deeply depressing. No one likes accepting any indirect responsibility for problems, whether we're an individual or an organisation or a government, or nor agreeing that changing our actions could make any difference. And you just have to think about the excuses you hear for not doing anything about climate change. There are so many big countries. We're very small. What difference can one person or one city make? Technology will solve it. It's somebody else's fault, and so on. The slogan, "Save the Earth," is very short and punchy, and it sounds good, doesn't it? But actually, our planet, will go on without Homo sapiens, no matter how many of us there are or there aren't. There have been, as you've said, many, many changes and extinctions in the past, and the Earth survives. It's just not the Earth as we have it right now. I mean, you've presented this very starkly with these immense challenges, and it looks as though we're just drifting into disaster. But I'm sure we all hope that you're wrong and that our politicians will suddenly become major leaders. But I suspect, actually, that may well not happen. So, next week, the Darwin College lectures continue with Professor Ian Morris from Stanford University, and he's going to talk about the economic effects of the huge reduction in population that occurred in the 14th century due to the Black Death. And his lectures are called Plagues and Economic Collapse. But for tonight, once again, Stephen Emmott, thank you very, very much indeed. And you've given us all so much to think about. Thank you.